Hello, my name is Caleb Wallace. I am a senior here at the University of West Georgia. I'm a history major with a minor in German. This is my senior seminar research presentation entitled Shattered Loyalties: How Hunger Destroyed the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is still producing fresh analysis and discussion today. That's one of the reasons why I like this topic so much, that many of the same issues that affected Austria-Hungary in the late Habsburg era are still relevant today in the world. There are things we're still wrestling with. For instance, identity, nationality, minority rights, language. Russia and Ukraine, as we speak, are at war over issues that would not sound unfamiliar to Austro-Hungarian subjects. This topic has been covered by many eminent historians. Some of my favorites are F.R. Bridge, Arthur J. May, Edward Crankshaw, Alan Sked. More recently, Peter Judson and Maureen Healy and Alexander Watson have put out some excellent works that ask new questions and frame the Habsburg Empire in new ways, and their research contributed greatly to my own research in this project. My focus is specifically on hunger and its effects as a destabilizing element in Austria-Hungary during the First World War, particularly as it concerned the multinational character of Austria-Hungary. The question I have asked is, what was it about World War I that was so destructive to Austria-Hungary? Clearly there was a brutal war and Austria-Hungary was on the losing side, but I wanted to go a little deeper and see exactly what determined the path that civil society took in Austria-Hungary during the war, and what the extreme food shortages, the impact that it had on the citizens of the empire. During the first 2 years of the First World War, the war effort in Austria-Hungary actually enjoyed quite a bit of popular support. For the purpose of this study, the main characteristic of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was many things to many people. It was Austria-Hungary, it was the Danubian monarchy, the Habsburg Empire. It goes by many different names, but most importantly, for us it was a Vielvölkerstaat, which means a multinational state. It was home to no fewer than 11 national minorities that spoke a variety of languages and belonged to different religions. And there's several cohesive elements that kept society on the same path at that time. Number one, Catholicism was very important. 4/5 of the population belonged to the Catholic Church, and that was a legitimizing institution that kind of unified the many disparate peoples in Austria-Hungary. Second of all, there was an almost universal fear of a Russian invasion, and it was the same as in their German neighbor that rallied a lot of people to support the war effort and keep Tsarism from taking over the empire. Third, probably most importantly, would be the Emperor Franz Josef. His person by itself was a commanding presence, and he was kind of the center of people's affections in Austria-Hungary. He had a very uniting effect. He'd been on the throne for 65 years, and he'd achieved remarkable longevity as well as a good deal of popular legitimacy. So Habsburg troops, they may have been from many different nationalities with different backgrounds, but by and large they shared a devotion to the Habsburg monarchy, especially Franz Josef, who had been on the throne longer than most of them had been alive. So despite these unifying factors that kind of kept the people of Austria-Hungary together, the solidarity began breaking down almost immediately, and it was the state's own fault as they enacted harsh military rule in the border regions of the empire and encouraged people to denounce each other and turn their neighbors in over suspected disloyalty, especially Slavic people in the empire. And all this did was serve to alienate and offend otherwise loyal citizens, particularly as the war effort declined and Austria-Hungary's military suffered several catastrophic defeats within just the first 2 months of the war. One of the most disastrous, as far as this study goes, was the loss of the province of Galicia, which was 1/3 of Austria's arable land. And when Russia occupied and took over Galicia in September 1914, in one fell swoop, immediately Austria was in a dire strait as far as being able to feed her own population. Two concepts that were extremely important in the Austro-Hungarian home front were Opferwilligkeit, which is basically willingness to sacrifice and the need to sacrifice for the troops at the front. The other concept was Durchhalten, which is holding out, basically promising that you would endure and put up with a reasonable sacrifice and shortages for the sake of the war effort. And this held together reasonably well for the first couple of years of the war. Things started to change when the food shortages started to get more severe. The initial cause of many of the food shortages in the Central Powers was the Allied blockade, which authorities in Austria-Hungary characterized as an Aushungerungskrieg, which is a starvation war. And they weren't far off the mark. There's actually the British blockade of German ports is still controversial because it was of dubious legality. But at the same time, even though it was harsh, it was a convenient scapegoat for the Austro-Hungarian government for the initial stages of the shortages because they had someone to blame for their own mismanagement, and it was very convenient. But before long, public anger started to turn from the Allies to their own government when they saw the ineptitude that was involved. For instance, Austria-Hungary never really worked out an efficient central system of food distribution. They devolved authority for distribution to private clearinghouses called Zentralen, which were essentially cartels, and they never were able to get a good hold of the food crisis for the entire war. So Austria-Hungary was actually the first combatant nation to enact a rationing system during the First World War. The first bread cards were introduced in April 1915, and by the end of the year, potatoes, flour, fat, sugar had largely disappeared from the shelves. The caloric intake on a daily basis for Austro-Hungarian citizens plummeted from 2,500 calories a day to about 830 a day at the end of the First World War. So body weights were dropping, the death rate was increasing dramatically, birth rate went down, people lost an immense amount of weight. Tuberculosis and hunger, edema, and influenza were even more rampant because people's immune systems were compromised. For sure, at least in Vienna, where the shortages were at their most extreme, community values were eroded. There was, no more sense of empathy. It kind of became a frightening fight for survival in most of the urban areas of the empire. When shortage of food, people really began to turn on each other, and the Opferwilligkeit and Durchhalten, the two twin pillars of society, due to hunger, were eroding very, very rapidly by 1916. What needs to be understood about the rationing system is that having a ration card did not necessarily guarantee either the product's availability or its price. So it just specified an amount that you could get if the product were available. So in order to get some items, the black market was proliferating, which also caused a lot of division in society because people felt like the sacrifice that they were making was very one-sided, as those who could afford to use the black market would get their items there, and the state's inability to curb black market sales also delegitimized the state further in people's minds, since they couldn't return the sacrifices their citizens were making in a satisfactory way. Another bleak element that was introduced was the refugee crisis. As war refugees came in, especially from Galicia, they were rehoused in Vienna, had 200,000 refugees that settled there. And where there was already scarcity and people were competing for nutrients, the addition of all of these refugees brought a whole new chaotic dynamic to the survival situation. Not only that, but many of the refugees were poor peasants, and most of them were Orthodox Jews, and they were alien not only in dress and behavior, but in the Yiddish tongue that they spoke. So a lot of old anti-Semitic antagonism started coming to the fore once again, as Jews are rumored to be in charge of the black market. And the Habsburg government had never entertained anti-Semitism like some other European governments had at the time. In fact, they had a reputation for tolerance. But with the erosion of state legitimacy, a lot of these anti-Semitic attitudes came to the forefront again, and relationships between different people groups was starting to break down considerably. So the pervasive hunger combined with the refugee crisis, kind of worked to create this environment driven by rumor and conspiracy. Rumors carried a lot of weight, especially when people were lining up for food for hours at a time. Rumors went through the food lines and they carried a lot of significance. So a lot of the letters that we read from the period that are written in German, they'll use the phrase man sagt, which means they say or it is rumored that. So people really took these rumors to heart, especially in Vienna, particularly the Czech minority were accused of being Russia friendly. So a lot of the denouncements that took place where people were turned in for being disloyal, these involved Czech citizens. And the turning point was the winter of 1916 to 1917, which was known as the Turnip Winter or the Stechrubenwinter. It was the point where the government in Austria-Hungary and Germany was out of solutions and they had to requisition the turnips from the farmers. Turnips were usually used as pig fodder, but this is all that the people had to live on at this time. So turnips got the people through the winter barely. In Austria, particularly with the food and fuel shortages together, they just shivered and starved their way through the entire winter. As Alexander Watson says, society in Austria-Hungary didn't just fragment along class lines. It was much more chaotic and fundamental. Like basic social interactions were impacted by this. A good example is that in November 1916, Franz Josef, the monarch of Austria-Hungary, had been on the throne for almost 67 years total. He passed away in November, and the response from the public was pretty muted, actually. People were so hungry and desperate to secure nutrients that his death really passed without a lot of attention and notice in Vienna. He was replaced by his grandnephew, Emperor Karl, who seemed more reform-minded, and people were curious as to what he would offer. But more important than any dynastic change was just that hunger was affecting the Austro-Hungarian Empire to a fatal extent by this point. There was also an urban and rural divide that came into play. Urban dwellers would go out on foraging trips, which was called hamstering or hamstern, because they compare them to hamsters going out and foraging what they could. They encountered farmers and other villagers who were happy to sell their goods and their produce outside of state controls, but it ended up in kind of mutual dislike between the urban and rural population because for the perspective of farmers and rural people, seeing the high prices that city dwellers were willing to pay for produce, it convinced them that they weren't as hard up as they claimed. Whereas urban dwellers started to really despise the rural population because they looked at them as war profiteers who were making a profit off of people's misery. So urban and rural bonds were broken down. It became just another dark element as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was kind of hurtling toward its end at this point, that all of these different intersocial relationships in Austria-Hungary were compromised by the fact that people's main priority at this point was just securing nutrients. The demise of Austria-Hungary in 1918, as I said previously, the story is pretty well known. One by one, the national groups simply broke away from the empire as the state had completely lost its legitimacy. Emperor Karl was idealistic, inexperienced. He wanted to do right by the people, but it was too little too late at this point. And there was nothing he could do to save the monarchy as it was kind of inexorably sliding towards destruction by summer of 1918. That said, the breakup of the monarchy wasn't a foregone conclusion until pretty late 1918, actually. Like, most people expected the empire to still be standing at the end of the war, albeit in reorganized form, but that's not what happened. And one of the reasons is people's trust in the Habsburg state was almost completely bankrupt at this point, since the state could no longer provide for the people, and their sacrifice increasingly felt very one-sided. They lost interest in affairs of state, essentially. Hunger as a fixture of society did not end after the end of the First World War. Actually, most of Central Europe struggled with supply and food problems for at least another year, in some areas until like 1921. And food actually shaped the way a lot of Austro-Hungarian subjects remembered the war and conceptualized it. That's something I wanted to emphasize in this study. I hope I shed a little bit more light on the way that hunger and shortages were connected to these destabilizing and delegitimizing of the Habsburg Empire from 1914 to 1918. I would like to thank all the sources I used. Hopefully I was able to shed a little bit of light on this particular topic. And thank you so much for listening. I look forward to any questions.